Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I am Emily Bennington with the Circle of Atonement here with Robert Perry, lead editor of the Complete and Annotated Edition of A Course in Miracles. And today we are talking about reason. Specifically, this podcast was inspired by a section in the CE, chapter 21, section 5, called Reason as the Undoing of Insanity. We covered this section recently in a Course Companions text class, and Robert and I just found this topic so interesting that we decided to come with a podcast about it. And part of the reason why we can't stop talking about this idea is that here in spiritual circles, we are awash in the idea that we need to put our reason aside, put our thinking mind aside, and get to the heart, get to feeling. And so we have the Course has a lot to say about that, and so do we. So, Robert, it's wonderful to be back with you talking about reason in the Course.
Yeah, it's great to be back. I think this is such an important topic, and obviously the reason why we're doing this is because we get so many messages in spirituality from so many different spiritual teachers and teachings that contrast the mind and thinking and reason and logic with the heart and feeling and knowing and being. And the idea, and we've all heard these messages a million times, the idea is that the mind and thinking and reason is the very thing we need to set aside. We need to stop thinking for the sake of our spiritual development and awakening. And instead, we need to get into the heart, which just feels, which just knows, and I think just loves.
Yeah, and just to be clear here at the beginning, the Course, the end goal of the Course is to take us back to knowledge. And that is a state where we just know, but
Right.
that we're not capable of that state here in these bodies. And so therefore, we need to employ our thinking mind and our reason to ascend within our spirituality.
Yeah, and we'll get to the role the Course sees for reason. But yes, the goal is knowledge. We can only have sort of brief visits to knowledge while we're in this world. It's a transcendental state. In that state, the Course says we have thoughts, but they're thoughts that we wouldn't readily recognize as thoughts. They aren't much like our current thoughts. They're changeless, they're eternal, they are boundless. They're not the kind of thing that we think of when we use the word thought.
Yeah. So we're ultimately headed to that state of grace where we are in a state of being and knowing and loving. It's just that we can't leapfrog there. We can't think that we're there now.
Right. So how do we get there?
How do we get there? Yeah.
One thing I would say about all those messages that we get in spirituality is they're so like continual, and we're surrounded by them so much that I think many Course in Miracles students assume the Course talks that way, that the Course talks about a contrast between mind and heart, in which mind is kind of the block that's in the way, and heart is the good guy, it's the goal. And I think Course students would be, many of them at least, surprised to hear that you cannot find one contrast between mind and heart in the entire Course. Mind is never characterized as the bad guy and heart's the good guy. Whenever they appear next to each other, they're always paralleled. Always. Literally always. So that's probably a surprise. The Course's system is not one in which is trying to get us out of our mind and into our heart.
Yeah, and throughout it places great value on reason. You and I were looking at before we hit record the number of times that reason appears in the Course, and it's over 200. So he really wants us to be using our mental capabilities to reason ourselves out of negative emotion and dysfunctional states.
Right. Reason's a huge thing in the Course, and I find it really telling that if you listen to course students and teachers, it's not a topic. It's not like a course term. It's not a course topic. You just never hear it referred to. And yet, in the section that you mentioned, section 5 of chapter 21, reason is introduced as a topic, and then it's just discussed incessantly for quite a while in
But
the text.
it's not even that you don't hear reason discussed so much in course circles. It's that you don't hear reason discussed much in spirituality in general, more broadly. It's just
Right.
not something that's on the table too much. In fact, as you were saying before, we're trying to get away from the thinking mind in spirituality, not bring ourselves back to it.
Right. And when you hear reason talked about in a spiritual context, I often hear it discussed in a way that assumes that reason will naturally get you to believing that the physical is all there is, that science is the only voice, that egos and separation is the nature of things. It's assumed that reason naturally reproduces those same old conclusions. So in the course, reason is, as we're saying, it's smiled upon to a degree that I think most spiritual students and even most course students would find unimaginable. At the same time, it's a somewhat different kind of reason than we're used to. So we probably should just dive into this whole topic.
Yeah, can we start with a definition of reason?
Yeah, I pulled up some definitions just from Merriam-Webster Dictionary, which are really good ones. The first one says reason is the power of comprehending, inferring, or thinking, especially in orderly, rational ways. Second one is proper exercise of the mind. And the third one, which is really interesting and telling, and which the course definitely has in mind, is simply sanity. So reason and sanity are synonyms to the point where sanity is one of the definitions of reason. Now, personally, I like to think of reason as it stands in contrast with logic, because the course talks about logic and reason both. And what it says about logic is that the ego and the Holy Spirit have impeccable logic. So both the ego and the Holy Spirit use logic. But it says that while the ego is perfectly logical, it is clearly insane. And there's the idea of sanity. So the ego has no sanity, and we'll see shortly, the ego has no reason. So while the ego has perfect logic, it has no reason whatsoever. And the contrast between those two ideas of reason and logic, I've always thought of in terms of what I learned in my logic class back in college, which was that you can have two kinds of arguments that are logical, where the logic is perfect. Okay, one kind starts with false premises, carries them out logically, but because it starts with false premises, it arrives at false conclusions. The conclusions are logical, but false. Okay. The other kind of argument starts with true premises. It carries those premises out logically and therefore arrives at true conclusions. That's called a sound argument. Whereas the previous one was simply valid, meaning the logic was valid. This argument is sound, meaning the logic is valid and the conclusions are true, or the conclusion is true. So we should not think of reason and logic as interchangeable. They're not synonyms. Reason, you can be logical, which just simply means consistent in your thinking. That's all logic is. You just are consistent. You can be logical but insane, but you can't be reasonable but insane. Right? One of the definitions of reason is sanity. So in reason, you're exercising logic, but you're starting with true premises. And I think that's exactly what Jesus has in mind in the Course. If you see things that he calls reason, it's where he starts with premises that you'd mostly only find in the Course. Really extreme premises about the nature of God, for instance, and God's creation. And then he carries those out logically to reach conclusions that are logical, but they're also, in his view, sane, a kind of sanity that is beyond what we call sanity.
Yeah, that idea of starting with a true premise and carrying logic to a true conclusion is really fascinating because we tend to get that wrong. And we start with egoic premises
Mm-hmm.
nine
Yeah.
times out of 10,
Oh,
and then
yeah.
we follow them through to egoic responses. And so can we go into an example of a true premise that as course students we can use to maybe get through some difficult situation or emotional disequilibrium?
Well, once you understand what reason is, which is, as we're saying, true premises, or sorry, logic applied to true premises, thus yielding true conclusions. Once you understand that idea, you see it everywhere in the Course because the Course is always applying logic. It's always saying, because, for, therefore, thus, and so. You see that all over the place. And obviously, it's always applying that logic to its idea of true premises. And so it's using reason all over the place, and it wants us to use that reason, not just as a tool. And it's not even talking about reason as a tool for navigating in this world. It sees it as a powerful tool for spiritual awakening, which is the very opposite of the messages we're getting all the time. So I
Yeah,
know
and
you're looking for examples, but I just wanted to say that.
yeah, and I'm looking for examples that would help a listener apply course teachings to their life. And I will say that there's one that appears right in the introduction. Nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. And I've used that countless times in moments of great stress where I've just applied that to pull myself up rather,
Mm-hmm.
and move forward. So what other premises, true premises, could students start with?
Yeah. I think in that one, nothing real can be threatened. That's one of those Course premises that you would not start from in normal thinking in this world, right? In our experience, everything real can be threatened. The solar system is going to pass away one day. It's going to be annihilated at some point. That's one of those Course premises. Nothing unreal exists is what you'd call a tautology, right? Obviously, if it's unreal, it does not exist. And then you're kind of left with, well, I
I
can
don't
be
know
in
what
the,
a tautology is, but
okay. It's, you're stating the same thing in different form. Um, yeah. So, you know, herein lies the peace of God because everything that is real is safe, right? It can't be threatened.
mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's a great example. There's tons of examples. I've just got a few here. One is lesson 14 in the workbook, where we have this practice where we pick disasters and we say, God did not create that. Like, for instance, God did not create that war in, and you name the location. And so it is not real. And that's a classic bit of Course logic and Course reason, because you have a certain premise that's not, he often doesn't state the premises. They're sometimes implied or often implied. So the implication in this one, or the unstated premise, is God created everything real. So he's got an implicit argument here. God created everything that is real. God did not create that war in Syria. And so it is not real.
You know what I'm going to say here, because
Yeah, I know what you're going to say.
that practice is used to dismiss the world in a way that makes us feel comfortable not doing anything in the world. So I think that teaching has been somewhat dangerous in the wake of coronavirus, because I've heard course teachers say God didn't create coronavirus and therefore it's not real, so don't wear your mask or bring your hand sanitizer, folks.
Yeah.
And so how do you
I would say
square
that
those two things?
well, you square them by just reading the whole course. You don't take something out of the context of the rest of the course. And the whole course assumes that we're here to be miracle workers. We are here to take action in the world and express love through our miracle giving. The course has a huge amount about asking for guidance for our behaviors, about basically expressing love in our interactions, taking our part as saviors of the world, having a function in the world. So you don't pare all that away and take that line in isolation. You have to take it all together. But the course has a huge amount as well about finding emotional relief from what seems to be the threats of this world through realizing the unreality of the world and that it's a dream. It's a collective dream, yes, but it's still a dream. And that can provide enormous emotional relief, which that line is trying to give us.
Yeah, and it's similar to the one I just referenced from the introduction. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal
Yeah.
exists.
So why do you like that one and not this one?
Because, well, for the reasons I just stated, I think that that practice in particular is used to withdraw from the world when really I think the course is teaching us to understand how to approach the world from a loving perspective. So I feel like sometimes what students pull from it is the opposite of the message that was intended.
Yeah.
So anyway,
So
but
here's
the
another
point
one.
is, okay, go ahead.
Here's another one. This is from Review 5 in the workbook. Really great practice, which is God is but love, and therefore so am I. Now, that also is one of those with an unstated premise, which is God created me out of his own nature. He's only love, therefore I am only love. And there's a great example of course reasoning. And that reasoning, what's great about it is if you accept the premises, reason gets you to a place where you accept an authoritative conclusion that was not your previous conclusion. So most of us don't go around thinking we are love. Divine love is the very substance of our being. We think, well, I'm kind of loving some of the time and I'm pretty unloving much of the time, and I feel bad about myself as a result. So to be reasoned to an authoritative conclusion based on the eternal nature of God that you are only love is a powerful example of how transformative reason can be.
Yeah, I've found this idea to be incredibly important as far as my own personal practice this year, is that if you can stand for a premise that's true, if you can hike yourself up to it whenever you need to, then you can trust that your behavior will be more wise as a result. And if what you're thinking, what you're starting with, what your premise is untrue or egoic, like I'm a victim of the world, I can be hurt, then if you follow that through, you're starting with an insane premise, you're
Right,
going to
right,
have an insane result. And so
right.
your behaviors are completely different depending on the foundation that you're starting with in your mind.
It's interesting you say that, because that reminds me of the place early in the text. I think it's towards the end of chapter 3, where he says basically your starting point has been the authority problem, right? That we have a problem with God being the authority. And that because that's our starting point, all of our thinking is insane. It's exactly what you're saying. If we
Mm-hmm.
choose an insane premise to start with, all of our thinking simply being an instance of carrying out that premise logically, all of it will be insane. And that's what we tend to call reason, right? You start
Yeah.
with what the Course calls an insane premise, you carry that out logically, and we call that reason, but you end up with what the Course would call an insane conclusion, and therefore it's not reason, because reason is sanity.
Right. And this is how we end up with our insane world. But the The sneaky thing about the ego is that it also attempts to use reason. So, how do we know? How do we distinguish between what is a true premise and what isn't?
Well, that I think gets us into some of the things that are said about reason in the section that we referenced at the beginning, reason as the undoing of insanity. Because, well, so let's go into those and we can circle back to your question. Okay. So
We're just going to forget about the question. You know
we
that, right?
will not forget about it. Okay. His stance in this section regarding reason is really extreme. He says here, reason is a means which serves the Holy Spirit's purpose in its own right. It is not reinterpreted and redirected from the goal of sin, as are the others. So he's been talking just 2 sections previously about faith, belief, and perception. And the idea is the ego uses faith. It has us place faith in its premises, for instance. The ego uses belief. We believe in things of the ego. The ego uses perception. We perceive in a way guided by our ego. Okay. And yet the Holy Spirit can take those faith, belief, and perception and redirect them and reinterpret them and use them for his purposes. Okay. Now, in this section, he's saying reason is not like that. It serves the Holy Spirit's purpose in its own right. It inherently serves the Holy Spirit's purpose. It can't be used for the ego. The ego never uses it. In fact, let me go on to another quote. He says, quote, in regard to reason, the ego never uses it because it does not realize that it exists, which is amazing. So the ego has no concept of actual reason. Its reasoning, which is put in quotes in this section because it's not real reasoning, is always based on false, insane premises. So true reason, he says in this section, quote, lies in the other self you have cut off from your awareness. And then he says, nothing you have allowed to stay in it, to stay in your awareness, is capable of reason. So the idea here is that we're in a state of mind heavily governed by the ego. And reason is so ego transcendent that it lies in a self, a higher self, or we'll just say a higher self we have cut off from our awareness. And what stays in our awareness without help, without aid, can't do reason. We'll never start from truly sane premises. Okay. And so I think what we have to do here is we have to lean on the Course and how it uses reason. We have to lean on the Holy Spirit. And only by leaning on those sources can we engage in the kind of reason that says, God is only love, and therefore I am only love. And there's countless other examples, but all those examples we wouldn't do on our own.
Right. And this is what we were touching on earlier, that there's the madness of the ego, and then there's the knowledge of God. And in between, here we are. And we have to use reason to get ourselves closer and closer and closer to spiritual enlightenment. And therefore, our thinking mind has to be online, because
Right.
if we're just trying to feel, then we can't get there. We think we are there, but we're not there. We use reason to get to knowledge.
Yeah, and there's a lot in there in what you just said that I want to draw out a bit. One is that this section says that basically you don't need reason in the state of knowledge, the state of heavenly awareness, okay? And in the state of the ego, which he calls madness, you can't, reason's nowhere to be seen. Reason can't enter that state. And so it's only in between madness and knowledge that reason pertains and is useful. And he says it's only the partially insane, which means partially sane, who need it. So hopefully we are not completely in the madness of the ego. Our world seems to be quite in the grip of that. Hopefully we're, getting above that to some degree. And in the state we're in, between madness and knowledge, we need reason. And then the next thing you mentioned is, why do we need it? What I find is that when I have feelings that the Course would say are of the ego, feelings that we would call negative, anger, worry, fear, guilt, depression, grief, et cetera, sadness. When I have those feelings, my mind's telling me they reflect the real situation, right? They reflect the truth. And yet, we do assume that feelings should be reflective of what's real, of the real situation. And so if reason can come in, reason in the Course's sense, can come in reasoning with us from true premises and leading us to a completely different conclusion, that conclusion, if it's truly reasonable, rational, it's authoritative. And we can use the authority of that conclusion to basically dispel those unwanted emotions. And that is the beauty and the power of reason. So for instance, if we are saying to ourselves, I'm so unloving, I just can't stand myself. I have flashes of being loving, but there's so much else that's there. And it's depressing. If we can then bring in true reason and say, God is but love, and since he created me, therefore, so am I. In my reality, I am pure love. I'm made of love. I'm love personified. To the extent that we can accept that conclusion as authoritative, to that same extent, we dispel those feelings of guilt and low self-esteem.
That's a beautiful idea. And it brings up an important point, I think, to make. The Course isn't trying to get us to reason ourselves out of all emotion. It's not trying to get us to reason ourselves out of all feeling. It's trying to get us to reason ourselves out of negative, dysfunctional, toxic feelings.
Right.
Do you want to say
Right.
anything about that distinction?
Yeah, it's a really good distinction, because historically you associate reason with reasoning oneself out of emotions into this like neutral, really cerebral, emotionless state. And from the Course's standpoint, reason is there to reason us out of the ego's emotions into the true and positive emotions like joy, like love, like peace. Because those are the emotions that fit with those true premises, right? If God is pure love, and also the true conclusions, if that means we're pure love, you know, a neutral, emotionless state does not fit that, right? Joy fits that.
Mm-hmm.
Like incredible peace fits that. So reason in the Course is trying to reason us out of the negative emotions into what the Course would call, maybe, and this is not a Course term, but it's, I think, accurate, into the truly eternal emotions that the Course wants us to get to.
Reason offers us so much. If we can reason our way out of the emotional outbursts and the again the dysfunction that we often find ourselves in, I mean, it's just insanity that we find ourselves in. Why don't we employ it more often?
Well, I think what it is that our ego does not like to be overruled. It wants the freedom to feel whatever it feels. And its feelings are based on the notion that I am this limited, separate self that, is the center of the universe, is under assault, and,
It's not going to be
must
bossed around by anybody, including
won't
God.
be bossed around by anybody, must get what I want. If we question and undermine the feelings that reflect that basic view, the view itself seems like it's under attack. Okay, so if someone tells us you don't have to feel that way, we might say, but, I matter. It's important that I feel this way. I've got to stand up for these feelings, because something in us feels like if we let those feelings go, it's almost like we're letting ourselves go as we understand ourselves. And so I feel like there's something in the ego that loves this notion that reason can't come in and overrule our feelings. The ego loves that. So as long as we say feelings are it, they're the pinnacle, then I feel like our ego is protected, because
Hmm.
what has the authority to come in and say, no, you're wrong?
We're so ruled by our feelings. And so there must be something in us that values that, that considers that there's some kind of payoff in the negative emotions that we constantly find ourselves swimming in, when we could, as the Course repeatedly says, easily get out of them with reason, but we choose
Yeah.
not to.
Yeah.
So why is it that there must be something in us that is going against the goal that God has for us, or we would, because it's
I
just
th-
a matter of a choice.
I think it's just that our ego feels kind of protected, safe, reinforced by that. I mean, it's not just our feelings. Behind those feelings is our ego's, quote, reasoning. Okay. And that whole system of its reasoning, its thinking, leading to its feelings, that whole system reinforces it. And so if a higher, more authoritative reason comes in, overrules all that, the ego itself is under threat. It's being overruled. And that's the last thing most of us want. And so I feel like this kind of anti-reason, anti-thinking value system that we find in the spiritual realm is part and parcel with basically nobody tells me what to do, individualism that
But
is rampant in the culture.
but isn't that just the that anti-intellectualism is what keeps us away from reason? And that's what keeps us infantilized. Because if we're not employing our reason, and we're in that state of, you're not going to tell me what to do, then aren't we just adult children in the world?
Well, there's certainly an argument to be made for that. Yeah, and I think we can see so often from the outside that someone really proudly, defiantly hanging on to their victimhood, and their right to retaliate because of victimhood. We can feel the ego in that, and hopefully we can then see, okay, that perhaps there's a lot of ego in our own stance in relation to feelings and reason and so on.
So
Go ahead.
that's really good, because we all feel the victim of something. And so if somebody is feeling traumatized, or like they're victimized by some situation in the world, how can they use reason and these premises to get themselves to a place where they can overcome those feelings? Like, let's do something really practical to help them.
Well, the course is full of using reason to
What would
overcome
you
feelings
do?
like that. I
What
think I would probably pull some favorite workbook lesson, out of the course, uh, like God is but love, and therefore so am I, or like God did not create this whatever situation, and so it is not real. I mean, those things are the most practical thing I've ever found for changing my feelings. And yeah, you have to say them with a certain kind of intent and a certain kind of focus, and say them slowly and think about what they mean. And all of that is not just a rote thing, but saying them in the right spirit, in the right way, is the most practical thing I've ever found for
Mhm.
dispelling negative emotions. And we all want to get rid of those negative emotions.
That feels like a good place to end. Do you have anything
Okay.
else that you want to say on this topic?
No, let's go ahead and end it. I guess the last thing I'll say is I'm hoping that through listening to this, people can entertain the idea that they can really hold reason to their hearts as a truly valuable thing, a truly valuable tool in their journey home.
Yeah, and again, just being immersed in this idea that the heart is ahead of the head,
Hmm.
and that it is our job as spiritual seekers to put aside the thinking mind or transcend the thinking mind. My hope is that anyone listening to this would, when they hear that messaging, would stop and think, and rather than just let it in and think, oh, that's true, yeah, because we hear it all the time,
Right.
but just stop and think, maybe that's not as true as we hear, and recognize the ways in which the course is asking us to use our reason to get to a higher state.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay, Robert, thank you so much as always, and I'll see you next time.
It's been fun.
Yeah, bye for now.